Wassily Kandinsky was a Russian painter and art theorist who, strangely, didn't start his painting career until he was 34 years old. Using color and form, he created pictures that communicated a universal sense of spirituality. For him, abstract art offered the possibility of a profound, transcendental experience, although, he thought copying from nature only interfered with this process. Born in Moscow in 1866, Kandinsky moved to Odessa when he was 5 years old to live with his aunt, where he learned to play the piano and cello in grammar school, as well as study drawing with a coach. As a child, he had always been fascinated with color and sound. He claimed he could hear his paintbox hiss when mixing colors, and, playing the cello represented one of the deepest blues of all instruments. We now know that all of this can be explained by a condition called synesthesia. That is Kandinsky's ability to see sound, and hear colors. In 1885, at his family's insistence, Kandinsky moved to Moscow to study law, where he later graduated with honors. In 1892, after romancing her during their studies together at university, Kandinsky married his cousin, Anna Shemiakina, who was 6 years older than he. Anna's family owned a large summer house in the Moscow area, and Kandinsky drew many subjects for his paintings from these surroundings. In 1893 he became an associate professor of the law faculty, and continued to teach. In 1896, Kandinsky was offered a full professorship at the University of Tartu in Estonia. In what he later called a now or never moment, he rejected materialism in his search for the spiritual, and turned down the offer. He moved to Munich, Germany, with his wife Anna with the intention of following his dream to become a painter. Anna, who had married a man she expected to be a lawyer, was not enthusiastic at the prospect of his new artistic direction, and only reluctantly followed her husband to Germany. Later on, Kandinsky recollected 2 events which he said had influenced his decision to leave the law and take up painting. The first was the emotional shock he experienced when he saw Monet's impressionist painting, Haystacks. The second was having a strange visual experience during a performance of Wagner's musical composition, Lohengrin, at the Bolshoi Theatre. "I saw colors before my eyes," he said, "wild, crazy lines." In Munich, Kandinsky studied painting. First at a private school, where he learned the basics of anatomical drawing and easel painting, and then, after 2 years, at the Munich Academy of Fine Arts. By 1900, Kandinsky had earned his diploma, and, over the next few years, achieved moderate success as a professional artist. Kandinsky's early paintings were landscapes that were heavily influenced by Impressionist artists, as well as Pointillism and Fauvism. In 1901, Kandinsky, and 3 other young artists, who were unhappy with the academic direction of the established art schools, co-founded Phalanx, an artists' association opposed to traditional forms of art. Phalanx expanded to include an art school and an exhibitions group. Kandinsky taught at the school. He was elected president of the association, and also became the director of the Phalanx School of Painting. In the group exhibitions that followed, Kandinsky tried to collect works which represented non-academic directions in art, such as Impressionism, Symbolism and, Kandinsky's latest interest, Art Nouveau, which he felt presented new opportunities for experimentation. 12 exhibitions were conducted over 3 years, with works of both known and unknown artists. Munich art lovers were unimpressed. Accepting the inevitable, Kandinsky closed Phalanx in 1904. Kandinsky's earliest paintings, in which he used vibrant colors, reflected the then current trends of Pointillism and Fauvism, as well as his love of Russian folk art. One of his best-known works of this period is Blue Rider, created in 1903. This breakthrough work shows a lone rider racing across a landscape, and represented a decisive moment in Kandinsky's artistic development. In this painting, he shows a clear stylistic link to the work of the Impressionists, particularly evident in the contrasts of light and dark on the sun-dappled hillside. The theme of the horse and rider reappeared in many of his later works. For Kandinsky, this motif signified his resistance to conventional aesthetic values, as well as the possibilities for a purer, more spiritual life through art. In 1902, Kandinsky exhibited for the first time with the Berlin Secession group of artists. He also produced his first woodcuts. These works provided an outlet for his inner need to cut through to the essence of things, and satisfied his yearning to reduce forms to abstractions, while at the same time conveying symbolic meaning. Between 1902 and 1904, his woodcuts show an ever more soaring lyricism and an ever greater degree of abstraction, as his mastery of the medium increased. Among his earliest efforts is The Singer, in which he makes a direct reference to music. In this restrained print, the studied composition, and the subtle color harmony, convey the effect of a musical chord. This was a word Kandinsky used to characterize the effect by which the successful work communicates its inner meaning. The work of art, he said, must resonate, so that the soul of the viewer vibrates with the same resonance. This thought recurs throughout Kandinsky's works and writings. In 1913, he brought these ideas together when he published his graphic masterpiece, Sounds, a book of poems and woodcuts. This so-called musical album consists of 38 prose poems he wrote between 1909 and 1911 and 56 woodcuts he began in 1907. Kandinsky said the idea sprang from an inner necessity for expression. The woodcuts were not merely illustrative, nor were the poems purely verbal descriptions. Kandinsky was looking for a synthesis of the arts, in which meaning was created through the interaction of text, image and sound. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was virtually impossible for women to get an art education in the established art schools. However, women were admitted to the Phalanx School, and would-be painter Gabriele Munter, soon to be the artist's lover, enrolled in 2 classes, sculpture, and also painting, with Wassily Kandinsky. Unlike many other teachers, Kandinsky explained things in detail to his students, and treated both males and females equally. That was something new for Munter, and it impressed her. Finding a sympathetic mentor in Kandinsky, she decided to work closely with him to increase her chances of becoming an artist. In the summer of 1902, Kandinsky invited Munter to join him at his summer painting classes just south of Munich in the Alps, and she accepted. Kandinsky, although he was married, pressed his student for romance. By the summer of 1903, they were secretly engaged, pending his divorce from Anna. In 1904, Kandinsky separated from his wife by mutual consent, and he and Munter started to live together. It was a very bold action for a young woman at the beginning of the 20th century. She openly lived with a married man as his wife. And, though it was more or less acceptable in bohemian circles, it was quite inappropriate in the middle-class environment they both came from. Between 1904 and 1909, Munter and Kandinsky traveled back and forth together between Munich and the rest of Europe and Africa. They visited the Netherlands and Tunisia in 1904. The following year was spent in Italy. During their European odyssey, Kandinsky and Munter went first to the Netherlands. While Kandinsky's paintings still looked similar to Neo-Impressionism, he made sketches of the port of Rotterdam and of Amsterdam, where color played a vital role for him. A certain chromatic abstraction began to appear in his work, as can be seen in this painting, Each Scene. Arguably, the most successful of Kandinsky's early outdoor studies during this time is the small painting, Beach Baskets in Holland, painted in 1904. Here, dabs of color are applied in a free, pointillist manner, leaving large areas of untouched canvas. But, This was an isolated experiment. The dabs of colors create a jewel-like mosaic surface, quite different from Impressionist pointillism. For the winter of 1904 to 1905, the couple visited Tunis. Here, Kandinsky experimented with pure color and new geometry. With the brilliant colors of the green dome against the white of the walls and views of the old city, Kandinsky had captured the Orient. He used a palette knife to sketch small seascapes at the beach, and views of sunbathed streets, using a more and more paste-like texture. His journey towards the progressive deconstruction of the subject progressed rapidly at this time. His naturalism continued to develop greater expression, particularly during his 5 months of leisure at Rapallo in the Italian Riviera, during the winter of 1905. Between 1906 and 1907, Kandinsky and Munter settled in the suburbs of Paris. During his stay, Kandinsky exhibited works at several salons, taking out the grand prize at the Autumn Salon of 1906. Munter, determined to make the most of her Paris stay, rented a house for herself, paid for it a year in advance, and began to work actively, while helping Kandinsky in preparing a personal exhibition. Kandinsky was unhappy. He felt that the Parisian atmosphere was full of Impressionism, which was alien to his thoughts and aspirations. He decided to leave, and was terribly depressed when Munter refused to go. They lived separately for a while to follow their own artistic directions. At this time the artwork of Gauguin, Matisse and other Fauves were being exhibited in Paris. This exposure to Fauvism resulted in Kandinsky starting to paint landscapes using color that was neither naturalistic nor descriptive. The dissolution of the subject matter into a moving mass of spots of autumn colors reached its zenith in his Park St. Cloud series, in 1906. Kandinsky's long trip came to an end in 1907. He then returned to Munich with Munter. Kandinsky's love of Russia, Russian folklore, and fairy tales are reflected in many of the works that he completed between 1905 to 1908. These works were not produced for nationalistic reasons, but because Kandinsky believed that they expressed an aesthetic urge that was more fundamental. Song of the Volga was exhibited at the Salon of Independence in 1907. Song shows the extent to which Art Nouveau had influenced Kandinsky's early work, just as Russian symbolism and popular art had done. In this work, Kandinsky sought to create an overall atmosphere steeped in mystery, rather than an historical account. The figures are not depicted individually, but in a group. He uses an abundance of spots and lines, with an enchanting tonality of color. In all these works, reality is left behind. The various areas of color are given equal weight, diminishing any sense of real perspective, and creating a mosaic-like surface, on which the figures float, as if enchanted. The mood and content of these works reached a climax in Kandinsky's monumental tempera, Colorful Life. Completed in Paris early in 1907, it was the largest painting Kandinsky had produced. Apart from its size, the painting reveals, in a single unified expression, the universal themes of life in its multiplicity and death in its mystery. These themes were to persist long afterwards in Kandinsky's body of work. In time, Kandinsky's relationship with Gabriele Munter became more and more complicated. One day he would ask her to marry him, another day, he would insist on their immediate separation. Kandinsky was in no hurry to formalize his relations with her, which was an extraordinary challenge to public opinion, for prim Germans. Her family tried to dissuade Gabriele from continuing relations with the artist. She resisted. For several years, Kandinsky was torn between his wife, Anna, and his mistress, Gabriele. In Germany, he and Munter still lived apart, gaining freedom and happiness only when traveling abroad together. In 1908, Gabriele bought a country house for herself in Murnau, in the Bavarian Alps, where she and Kandinsky spent their summer months together. Kandinsky had simple furniture made for the interior, some of which he decorated himself with stylized flowers and riders on galloping horses. Working part of the time in Murnau, and part of the time in Munich, Kandinsky began the process that led to the emergence of his first strikingly personal style, and finally, to his historic breakthrough into purely abstract painting. Many paintings of this early period were inspired by Murnau and its surroundings. Clearly recognizable as a landscape, the rich greens and purples in this painting show the heightened sense of color that Kandinsky would later push to extremes. He claimed that the colors of the landscape stayed with him, even in his dreams. And he began to construct paintings around particular experiences of color and light. He wanted the kind of painting in which colors, lines, and shapes, freed from the distracting business of depicting recognizable objects, might evolve into a visual language capable of expressing ideas and evoking deep emotions. This painting resembles a stained glass window, or a tapestry, in the depth and resplendent richness of its colors. Space has been compressed into several distinctly planar zones, which reinforces the upward thrust of the composition. Kandinsky's evolution toward non-representation is already clearly underway here. The forms are schematic, the colors non-naturalistic, and the general effect is that of a dream landscape. He was becoming more interested in abstraction, in which representational forms, whether people or places, would increasingly melt away and be replaced by colors and basic shapes. Painting landscapes began to free him from the figurative world, and moved him ever closer to the level of abstraction he desired. The joyful landscape with tower dates from this period, and it reflects everything Kandinsky was, and would become, as an artist. His vibrant palette and expressive brushwork provide the viewer with a sense of hope, rather than despair. For Kandinsky, painting was a sort of music for the eyes, and with landscape with tower, the viewer can feel the colorful primal rhythm of the scene. So intense was Kandinsky's preoccupation during 1908 with the application of this lyric manner to his paintings, that he abandoned woodcuts and tempera almost entirely, and instead devoted himself to landscape painting in oil. Within a few months of completing this canvas, Kandinsky would become the first modern artist to paint an entirely abstract work. Now, for the first time, he began to transfer to the oil medium the elements he had so successfully learned to manipulate in his woodcuts and lyric tempera paintings, namely line, flat planes of saturated color, and areas of black and white. His method was so successful that some paintings now showed the characteristics of woodcuts. For example, the graphic qualities of flattened perspective, and the equality of positive and negative forms, with clearer definition, are clearly seen in this painting. He began to think that paintings didn't need a particular subject, but colors and shapes alone could be art, and could express feelings. For example, he thought that yellow had the crisp sound of a brass trumpet, and that certain color combinations could harmonize, like chords on a piano. The shapes he was most interested in were the circle, the triangle and the square. The triangle would cause aggressive feelings, the square calm, and the circle, spiritual feelings. He moved further towards his abstracted vision, in this painting. The sides of the houses, the mountains, and the straight road running through the middle, are transformed into triangles and pyramids. The colors, too, are simplified. In 1910, Kandinsky painted his first truly totally abstract painting, in watercolor. He believed that art should put aside material concerns, and reveal spiritual truth. The message would be more powerful, if it were not tied to reality. It was this belief, that art could lead the way to spiritual renewal, that directed Kandinsky's entire career from then on. In 1909, Kandinsky, along with other artists, created the new Artists' Association of Munich, with Kandinsky as its president. The group's prospectus stated, "We start with the premise that the artist, in addition to the impressions which he receives externally from nature, is constantly accumulating experiences from an inner, spiritual world." But, after a highly critical response to his work in the association's second exhibition in 1910, he resigned, and, in 1911, mounted a rival exhibition with the German artist Franz Marc. This relationship was the beginning of the highly influential Blue Rider Group, which drew together international artists from different areas of the visual arts. These included folk art, but also music and theatre. All artists were united by a desire to express spiritual values through their work. The name, Blue Rider, refers to a key motif in Kandinsky's work, the horse and rider, which was for him a symbol for moving beyond realistic representation. The color blue also had deep emotional significance for him. The group championed modern art, the connection between visual art and music, the spiritual and symbolic associations of color, and a spontaneous, intuitive approach to painting, in its move toward abstraction. The outbreak of World War I, in 1914, led to the dissolution of the Blue Rider Group, but, despite their short tenure, the group deeply inspired the highly influential German expressionist style from then on. Kandinsky's monumentally successful art guide, concerning the spiritual in art, was published in 1912. He argued throughout the book that only art could allow us to reach truths beyond the reach of scientific research. Moreover, he believed it was the artist's role to open up these channels of communication, for others to experience. Kandinsky declared that these spiritual awakenings could be most accurately expressed through the spontaneous application of colors, shapes, lines and forms. It was this school of thought that led Kandinsky towards what he saw as the higher realms of abstraction. He viewed himself as a prophet, whose mission was to share this ideal with the world, for the betterment of society. Kandinsky viewed music as the most transcendent form of non-objective art. Musicians, he said, could evoke images in listeners' minds, merely with sounds. He tried to produce similar object-free, and spiritually rich paintings that alluded to sounds and emotions, through a unity of sensation. In his book, Kandinsky organized his work into three groups: impressions, improvisations, and compositions. Impressions were observations of the material world. Improvisations were spontaneous expressions of a mood or feeling, such as his work, Improvisation 2, shown here, also known as the Funeral March. His third group, compositions, were also inner visions, but on a grander scale, similar to a symphony. He painted only 10 compositions. A number of them were destroyed during the war, but his numerous sketches in preparation of these paintings give some insight into his working method. For example, hidden within the bright swaths of color and the clear black lines of this painting, Composition 4, Kandinsky portrayed several Cossacks with lances, as well as boats, reclining figures, and a castle on a hilltop. As with many paintings from this period, he represented the apocalyptic battle that he thought would lead to eternal peace. By eliminating most references to the outside world, Kandinsky expressed his vision in a more universal manner, distilling the spiritual essence of the subject through these forms, into a visual vocabulary. His sketch for Composition 2 shows a major stylistic advance. Kandinsky turns his back on conventional perspective in favor of broad fields of color, using linear elements to create depth. Improvisation 30 evokes the imagery of war. Whilst placing increasing emphasis on lines, shapes and colors to convey emotions, Kandinsky still uses recognizable elements, such as cannons, castles and a crowd of figures in this piece. Not so in his two largest works, both painted in quick succession in 1913, namely Compositions 6 and 7. These paintings embody his complex philosophical and pictorial ideas of that time. Kandinsky himself describes Composition 6 as the deluge, a cataclysmic event that ushers in an era of spiritual rebirth. He believed that painting itself resembled such a cataclysm. Painting is like a thundering collision of different worlds. Through conflict, they create that new world, which is the work, he said. Composition 7 was the result of 2 months of preparation, and over 30 drawings, watercolors and sketches. However, the final version was painted in 3 days. Commonly cited as the pinnacle of Kandinsky's pre-World War I achievement, Composition 7 shows the artist's rejection of pictorial representation through a swirling hurricane of colors and shapes. The operatic and tumultuous, roiling of forms around the canvas, exemplifies Kandinsky's belief that painting could evoke sounds, the way music evokes certain colors and forms. Even the title, Composition 7, aligned with his interest in the intertwining of the musical with the visual, and emphasized Kandinsky's non-representational focus in this work. After Germany declared war on Russia in 1914, Kandinsky, who was a Russian citizen, was forced to leave Germany. He traveled to Switzerland and Sweden with Munter and stayed for almost 2 years. He returned alone to Moscow in early 1916. Munter remembered Kandinsky's promise to marry her, and did everything to see him once again. In December 1916, she organized an exhibition in Stockholm, which featured works by Kandinsky, and also her own paintings. The pair met, but not for long. Gabriele could not understand what kept him in Moscow. Letters came less and less frequently. In the meantime, Kandinsky's heart was no longer free, but he did not say a word about it to Gabriele. His marriage in 1917 to Nina Andreevskaya was to mark the end of Kandinsky and Munter's relationship. On moving to Moscow, Kandinsky was depressed, and hardly painted in his first year back. When he picked up his paintbrush again in 1916, he decided to paint a portrait of Moscow. He represented the city's monuments in this painting, and captured the spirit of the city. Kandinsky rendered the landmarks in a circular fashion, as if he had stood in the center of Red Square, turned in a circle, and caught them all swirling about him. Although he refers to the outside world here, he continued his commitment to color, sound, and spiritual expression in art, in his other works at the time. In Moscow, he courted and married Nina Andreevskaya, the young daughter of a Tsarist colonel. The pair first met in the autumn of 1916. The artist was about to be 50 years old, and Nina was 17. Their courtship was short, and, despite their difference in age, the resistance of the bride's mother, and the revolutionary tremor in the air, Nina Andreevskaya and Wassily Kandinsky became husband and wife in February 1917. After their wedding, the couple went to Finland, and spent their honeymoon in Imatra, a small place famous for its rapids. Kandinsky's watercolor, Imatra, reflects the fairy tale idyllic mood of the newly married couple. Their first and only son, Vsevolod, was born the same year. The little boy died in 1920, during the civil war in Russia, unable to survive undernourishment, and some infectious disease. After the Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917, Kandinsky did not paint for 2 years. This was partly due to lack of funds, but he was also cooperating with the new government, taking on a number of roles in the new art institutions of the new regime. Kandinsky's plans to build a private school and studio had been upset by the communist redistribution of private wealth, and, instead, he worked with the new government to develop arts organizations and schools. In 1918, he became a professor at the Moscow Academy of Fine Arts, and a member of the arts section of the People's Commissariat for Public Instruction. His autobiographical book, Retrospect, was translated into Russian, and published by the Moscow municipal authorities. In 1919, he created the Institute of Artistic Culture, became director of the Moscow Museum for Pictorial Culture, and helped to organize 22 museums across the Soviet Union. In 1920, he was made a professor at the University of Moscow and was honored with a one-man show, organized by the state. In 1921, he founded the Russian Academy of Artistic Sciences. Between 1916 and 1921, Kandinsky did not finish a single major painting. This was his time for exploration and giving up abstraction to return to representational art. Kandinsky worked on watercolors, drawings, and etchings, and, inspired by Bavarian folk traditions, he also painted on glass. The naivete with which the universal religious motifs were rendered, and the freshness of color in the glass paintings, appealed to him. Not only were the formal simplifications, the bright colors, and the crude, uninhibited drawing satisfying, but the universal religious myths retold in this simple way provided their own impact. Kandinsky created close to 30 paintings on glass in the period 1916 to 1918. Several of the preparatory drawings and matching paintings on glass still survive. These works depict gallant scenes, with ladies and gentlemen enjoying their leisure, against a background of country estates and luxurious expanses of water, or pastoral motifs, with cows grazing in meadows. When Kandinsky started to paint larger pictures again in 1919, his works show a simplification of form and a more comprehensive structure. The canvases and watercolors of his Moscow years show a determination to be completely abstract. They also show a growing tendency to abandon the earlier spontaneous, lyrical, organic style, in favor of a more deliberate, rational, and constructional approach. The change is evident in such pictures as White Oval and In Grey. This painting is more subdued in color, and the shapes are starting to become increasingly sharp-edged, verging on the geometric. Ultimately, however, Kandinsky was out of sympathy with the government and the new revolutionary art. His work was considered too individualistic and typically bourgeois. In 1921, he left Russia, fleeing from the cold, the criticism of his colleagues on his work, the painful memories of his son's death, and also from the approaching totalitarian regime. Kandinsky and Nina went first to Berlin, and then, in 1922, Kandinsky took a teaching position at the Weimar Bauhaus. This was a groundbreaking new school of arts and craft, with a similar philosophy to the Blue Rider ideals that he so admired. He gained German citizenship in 1928. At the Bauhaus, Kandinsky lectured on the elements of form, gave a course in color, and directed the mural workshop. In 1925, when the school moved from Weimar to Dessau, he established a class in non-applied painting. In spite of the somewhat routine nature of his work, however, he appears to have found life at the Bauhaus rewarding and pleasant. The climate was one of research and craftsmanship, combined with a certain amount of aesthetic puritanism. In keeping with his search for internal understanding, the first paintings he produced at the Bauhaus all leaned heavily toward weightless geometric shapes and primary colors. Among the main works of this period, the geometric nature of Kandinsky's abstraction evolves and fully unfolds in Composition 8, painted in 1923. Form, as opposed to color, structures the painting in a dynamic balance that pulses throughout the canvas. This work is an expression of Kandinsky's clarified ideas about modern, non-objective art, particularly the significance of shapes, like triangles, circles, and the checkerboard. Kandinsky relied upon this hard-edged style to communicate the deeper content of his work for the rest of his career. After the Weimar years, which he designated as his cold period, he dedicated the painting, Yellow, Red, Blue, to the theme of the correspondences between form and color, with a composition that embodied creating visual depth through color, in the painting. Yellow, Red, Blue was his most important work while at Weimar, where he used the three primary colors to show the complex diversity within the color relationship, resulting in a cosmic and spiritual theme. The works of his later years in the Bauhaus show a shift from simply overlapping primary colors to create secondary colors, to a totally free deployment of various color shades, to experiment with foreground-background relationships. The most beautiful outcome of these theories is his work, Several Circles. Kandinsky painted this work in his 60th year, and it demonstrates his lifelong search for the ideal form of spiritual expression in art. A dark blue central circle, partially overlaid, like an eclipse by another black circle, is surrounded by smaller and larger circles in radiant colors floating on a dark background. The result of the overlapping of the transparent circles produces finely differentiated tones of color. The diverse dimensions and bright hues of each circle bubble up through the canvas and are balanced through Kandinsky's careful juxtapositions of proportion and color. In 1926, Kandinsky published his Bauhaus book, Point and Line to Plane, in which he tried to develop a kind of grammar for form, related to music. Point and line are not just elements of painting, but also of music, he said. The range of various musical instruments corresponds to the width of the line. A very thin line is produced by the violin, flute and piccolo. Kandinsky employed the word sounds throughout his theoretical writings and, on occasion, in titles of his artworks. Generally, this term is used in the sense of inner resonance or spiritual vibration. When first looking at this painting, it appears to be a collection of arrows, pointing in various upward directions, amidst a blurry, smudged background. However, all the elements of this work come together to show themes that Kandinsky used in all of his works, and taught as well, such as the use of specific shapes, colors, and lines to create an image. The lines of the arrows all come from three single points on a platform made of three bold and horizontal lines. This theme of three is repeated throughout the artwork. The majority of the shapes are triangles, with the exception of the rectangular line shapes and the 7 circles. These shapes serve as the basis for all Bauhaus artworks. They are not ornamental in any way, and are an example of the minimalist ideas of the Bauhaus philosophy, which Kandinsky had adopted as his own. In 1933, the Nazis forced the Bauhaus to close. Although Kandinsky had been a German citizen since 1928, he and Nina immediately moved to Paris. The last of his German pictures is the somber development in brown. Its title probably alludes to the Nazi brown-shirted stormtroopers who regarded his abstract art as degenerate. Here, Kandinsky explores the variety of tints and shades in the color brown, through painting intersecting planes in the background, contrasting with the white, brighter middle section of the piece. The Nazis confiscated 57 of Kandinsky's canvases during their purge of degenerate art in Germany in 1937. Kandinsky's reception in France was cool. Paris gave no recognition to abstract art, but preferred stylistic trends that lay somewhere between Impressionism and Cubism. He lived and worked in isolation, only occasionally visiting exhibitions by Miro, Asp and Magnelli, whom he admired. While in France, Kandinsky's style again shifted, and he experimented with biomorphic forms, which were more organic than the harsh geometric shapes of his Bauhaus paintings. His work became more and more inward-facing, with supple, non-geometric images suggesting microscopic organisms, and his color compositions evoking Slavic popular art. In 1936 and 1939 he painted his two last major compositions. These were the type of canvases he had not painted for many years. Composition 9 has highly contrasted, powerful diagonals, whose central form gives the impression of an embryo in the womb. Small squares of color, and colored bands, stand out against the black background of composition 10, like star fragments. Hieroglyphics with pastel tones cover a large maroon mass, which seems to float in the upper left corner of the canvas. This monumental painting relies upon a black background to heighten the visual impact of the brightly colored, undulating forms in the foreground. The presence of the black expanse is significant, as Kandinsky only used the color sparingly. It is evocative of the cosmos, as well as the darkness at the end of life. Last in his lifelong series of compositions, this work is the culmination of Kandinsky's investigation into the purity of form and expression through non-representational painting. Kandinsky lived the remaining 11 years of his life in an apartment in a Parisian suburb, becoming a naturalized French citizen in 1939. He spent his time during the war in daily work and leisurely evening walks with Nina. Life was difficult in occupied Paris. In the summer of 1944, Kandinsky began to feel ill. He died in December of 1944 in relative, but serene, isolation. Nina Kandinsky became her husband's only legal heir. After the war, prices for Kandinsky's paintings rose again, and Nina was free to sell them, setting a fair price, as well as donating works to museums and organizing exhibitions of his paintings. In 1973, her book of memoirs, Kandinsky and I, was published. In 1957, Gabriele Munter gave the Lombarcos Gallery in Munich a priceless gift, a few hundred of Kandinsky's works, drawings and watercolors. She also donated dozens of notebooks with sketches and diaries, as well as his letters and over 2,000 photos of the artist. 5 years later, Gabriele Munter died. Thousands of people from Munich, and many Kandinsky's fans from all over Europe and from overseas were at her funeral. In the early 1970s, Nina Kandinsky bought a chalet in Switzerland, known as Villa Esmeralda. In 1980, Nina was strangled to death in her bathroom at the villa. More than $7 million worth of jewelry was stolen. The killer was never found. American patrons, notably Solomon Guggenheim, avidly collected Kandinsky's abstract work. They became the key to shaping the mission of the Guggenheim Museum, which was dedicated to modern, avant-garde art. With over 150 of the artist's works in the museum's collection, Kandinsky became known as the patron saint of the Guggenheim. Wassily Kandinsky set the stage for much of the expressive modern art produced in the 20th century. His work, both artistic and theoretical, played a major role in the philosophic foundation for the abstract expressionists, as well as color-field painters, such as Mark Rothko, who emphasized the interrelationships of color hues for their emotive potential. Even in the 1980s, artists working in the neo-expressionist resurgence in painting, like Julian Schnabel and Philip Guston, applied his ideas regarding the artist's inner expression on the canvas of their postmodern work.